Michel de Montaigne, September 1571. In the circular tower that rises above his family estate in southwestern France, 38-year-old Michel de Montaigne sits surrounded by 1,000 volumes, a quill in his hand, and a blank sheet of parchment before him. The late afternoon sun filters through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes that dance like thoughts seeking form. He has retreated from public life, from the law courts of Bordeaux, from the political intrigues of a France torn by religious wars, to attempt something no one has tried before, to study himself with the same attention a natural philosopher might devote to the movements of planets or the properties of metals. What do I know? He writes, then pauses. The Latin phrase, "Q sais G," will become his motto, carved into the wooden beams above his head. But this is not the false modesty of a scholar fishing for compliments. This is the genuine bewilderment of a Renaissance mind confronting the collapse of medieval certainties while remaining skeptical of the new dogmas rushing to replace them. In an age when men kill each other over the proper interpretation of Scripture, Montaigne chooses doubt as his compass and curiosity as his guide. The books that line his library walls represent the accumulated wisdom of centuries: Plutarch's moral teachings, Seneca's Stoic philosophy, the essays of his beloved friend Etienne de la Bouteille, whose early death had shown Montaigne the fragility of all human bonds. Yet instead of finding answers in these volumes, he finds more questions. Each author contradicts another. Each system of thought claims absolute truth, while revealing its own limitations. Rather than despair at this confusion, Montaigne feels liberation. If the wisest men who ever lived could not agree on fundamental questions, perhaps the honest response is to admit ignorance and begin again with what he can observe directly, himself. This tower room will become the birthplace of the modern essay, a literary form that Montaigne invents to capture the movement of his own mind as it circles around questions without rushing toward premature conclusions. Unlike the systematic treatises favored by medieval scholars, Montaigne's essay, his attempts will meander like conversations with a friend, full of digressions, contradictions, and second thoughts that reflect how thinking actually happens rather than how it should happen according to logical rules. But Montaigne does not know yet that he is inventing a new way of writing, just as he does not know that his private investigations will eventually be read by Shakespeare, who will draw on them for The Tempest, or by Pascal, who will argue with them in his pen's or by countless future readers who will discover in these pages a voice that speaks to them across the centuries with shocking immediacy and warmth. He knows only that public life has exhausted him, that the certainties of youth have crumbled, and that the one subject he has never properly studied himself might prove the most instructive of all. The man writing in this tower will spend the next 20 years examining his own thoughts, feelings, habits, and contradictions with an honesty that will scandalize some readers and console others. He will write about his kidney stones with the same attention he gives to his reflections on friendship. He will admit to cowardice in battle and vanity in conversation. He will confess that he cannot remember what he had for breakfast, but can recall with perfect clarity a casual remark made 20 years ago. This relentless self-scrutiny will not make him a saint or a sage, but it will make him something perhaps more valuable, a fully realized human being who accepts his limitations with grace, while remaining eternally curious about the mystery of existence. Michel de Montaigne was born into a world where certainty was cracking and doubt was becoming a philosophical necessity rather than a spiritual failing. February 28, 1533, in the Château de Montaigne in the Périgord region of southwestern France, a realm where Latin was still the language of learning, where the new ideas of humanism were filtering down from Italy, and where the religious unity of medieval Christendom was beginning to fragment into the wars that would define 16th-century Europe. The future essayist entered a family that embodied all the transitions of the Renaissance: newly noble, culturally ambitious, and intellectually curious about the world that exploration and scholarship were revealing to be far larger and stranger than previous generations had imagined. His father, Pierre, had purchased the estate and its noble title, transforming the family from successful merchants into landed gentry through the kind of social mobility that Renaissance capitalism made possible. Pierre embodied the humanistic ideals of his era. He had served as a soldier in Italy, where he encountered Renaissance culture firsthand, and had returned to France with passionate convictions about education, governance, and the potential for human improvement through learning and experience rather than birth and tradition. The educational experiment that Pierre devised for his eldest son reflected both Renaissance optimism about human potential and practical wisdom about how learning actually occurs. Michel was raised speaking Latin as his native tongue, with servants instructed to address him only in the classical language that humanists considered essential for serious intellectual work. He was awakened each morning not by harsh commands, but by music, on the theory that gentle pleasures would associate learning with joy rather than compulsion. These early experiences would profoundly influence Montaigne's later conviction that education should cultivate judgment rather than memory, wisdom rather than mere erudition. The France of Montaigne's youth was experiencing the intellectual ferment that accompanied the rediscovery of classical texts and the challenge to established authorities that humanism represented. Printing presses were making books more widely available than ever before, enabling scholars to compare different versions of ancient texts and discover contradictions in authorities who had previously been accepted without question. The same critical methods that humanists applied to recovering authentic versions of classical works inevitably raise questions about religious and political authorities that claimed similar infallibility. The Protestant Reformation, which began when Montaigne was a child, transformed theological disagreements into political conflicts that would dominate European life for generations. The unity of medieval Christendom, which had provided intellectual as well as spiritual authority, was shattered by competing interpretations of scripture and rival claims to religious truth. Young Montaigne would witness the transformation of his homeland into a battlefield where Catholics and Protestants slaughtered each other with equal conviction about the righteousness of their cause. The legal education that prepared Montaigne for his career in the Parliament of Bordeaux provided him with training in rhetoric, logic, and textual analysis that would prove essential for his later literary work, but it also exposed him to the gap between legal theory and judicial practice that would influence his skeptical attitude toward all systematic approaches to complex human problems. The law courts of 16th-century France were theaters where abstract principles confronted particular circumstances, revealing how difficult it was to apply universal rules to the infinite variety of human situations. His friendship with Etienne de la Bouteille, which began when both men served as councillors in the Bordeaux Parliament, provided Montaigne with the most intense intellectual and emotional relationship of his life. La Bouteille was a brilliant political theorist whose essay on voluntary servitude analyzed how people collaborate in their own oppression. But more importantly for Montaigne, he was a kindred spirit who shared his love of classical literature and his questions about how to live wisely in turbulent times. The death of La Bouteille in 1563, when Montaigne was 30, created a wound that would never fully heal and would profoundly influence his understanding of friendship, mortality, and the isolation that defines human existence. The loss taught him that even the most perfect human relationships are temporary, subject to the same uncertainty that characterizes all earthly experience. This recognition would become central to his philosophy. Since nothing human is permanent, wisdom consists in accepting change while finding meaning in temporary connections and provisional insights. The political career that occupied Montaigne's middle years provided practical education in how power operates and how difficult it is to achieve good outcomes through political action, even when leaders are well-intentioned and circumstances are favorable. His service as mayor of Bordeaux during a period of religious war gave him first-hand Chapter 1. The humanist son, the Michel de Montaigne, in 1540 represented everything that Renaissance humanism promised about the possibility of improving human nature through education, travel, and exposure to the best that civilization had produced. 7-year-old Michel Acquem moved through this environment with the casual privilege of a child who had been given every intellectual advantage, while remaining unaware that he was participating in one of the most ambitious educational experiments of his era. His father, Pierre, had designed a household that would demonstrate how classical learning could be integrated with practical wisdom to produce not just learned men, but good men, capable of contributing to the common welfare while achieving personal fulfillment. The Latin conversations that filled the family's daily routines were not mere academic exercises, but attempts to recreate the intellectual culture of ancient Rome, where public service and private reflection were understood to be complementary rather than competing claims on educated men's attention. Michel learned to think in a language that connected him to centuries of moral philosophy, while developing fluency in modes of expression that emphasize precision, elegance, and the kind of measured judgment that classical authors had identified as essential for both literary achievement and practical wisdom. Pierre Écuom's library, which would eventually become Michel's most treasured inheritance, contained the texts that had shaped European humanism, Cicero's letters and speeches, which provided models for combining philosophical reflection with political engagement. Plutarch's Lives, which offered biographical studies of how great men had navigated moral challenges, and Seneca's Essays, which explored how Stoic philosophy could be applied to the practical problems of daily existence. These works suggested that ancient wisdom was not merely historical curiosity, but living resource for addressing contemporary challenges. The musical education that accompanied Michel's intellectual formation reflected Renaissance theories about the relationship between aesthetic experience and moral development. Daily exposure to carefully chosen compositions was designed to cultivate emotional sensitivity and refine judgment that would complement rational analysis in enabling wise decision-making. This integration of artistic and intellectual training would later influence Montaigne's conviction that good writing required not just logical rigor, but attention to rhythm, harmony, and the subtler qualities that make ideas emotionally compelling, as well as rationally convincing. The physical education that Pierre insisted upon for his son challenged medieval prejudices against bodily cultivation while reflecting classical ideals about the unity of mind and body that genuine education should achieve. Riding, swimming, and swordplay were not mere aristocratic accomplishments, but components of complete human development that would enable Michel to function effectively in various social situations while maintaining the physical vigor that sustained intellectual work. The servants who staffed the Montaigne household had been chosen not just for their practical skills, but for their ability to participate in the linguistic and cultural experiment that made the estate a kind of living classroom. German tutors provided exposure to the scholarly traditions of Northern Europe, while Spanish servants offered glimpses of the imperial culture that was transforming the Mediterranean world. This cosmopolitan environment taught Michel that human excellence could take many forms, and that wisdom was not confined to any single cultural tradition. The religious instruction that Michel received reflected the careful balance that educated Catholics had to maintain between traditional piety and humanistic scholarship that sometimes raised uncomfortable questions about church teaching and practice. Pierre Écuom was a devout Catholic who nonetheless insisted that his son learn to read scripture in Greek and Latin rather than accepting vernacular translations that might obscure original meanings. This approach encouraged critical thinking about religious questions while maintaining respect for ecclesiastical authority. The social rituals that structured life at the chateau provided practical education in the complex protocols that governed relationships among different classes and regions in 16th-century France. Formal dinners, religious observances, and interactions with visiting dignitaries taught Michel how to navigate social hierarchies while observing the psychological dynamics that made some individuals effective leaders, while others, despite equal formal authority, failed to command genuine respect or achieve practical results. Michel's early exposure to the management of agricultural estates and commercial enterprises provided concrete examples of how theoretical knowledge had to be adapted to particular circumstances in order to achieve practical results. Observing his father's decisions about crop rotation, tenant relations, and investment strategies, he learned that successful action required not just understanding of general principles, but sensitivity to the specific conditions that made abstract rules applicable or relevant in particular situations. The educational travels that took the family to various parts of France and occasionally to Italy provided Michel with first-hand experience of cultural diversity that would later influence his skeptical attitude toward claims about universal truth or natural law. Different regions had different customs, different approaches to similar problems, and different assumptions about proper behavior, suggesting that much of what people considered natural or necessary was actually conventional and contingent. The legal discussions that regularly occurred in the Écuom household, as Pierre consulted with professional colleagues about cases and judicial procedures, introduced Michel to the intellectual challenges that would later shape his career while revealing the gap between legal theory and courtroom practice. Abstract principles of justice had to be applied to specific situations involving particular individuals whose circumstances often complicated straightforward application of general rules. The correspondence that Pierre maintained with humanist scholars throughout Europe provided Michel with early glimpses of the international intellectual community that was reshaping European culture through collaborative scholarship and shared commitment to recovering classical wisdom. Letters from Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries brought news of textual discoveries, philosophical debates, and educational innovations that suggested learning was a collective enterprise transcending national boundaries. Michel's childhood illnesses and recoveries provided early education in human frailty and the limits of both medical knowledge and parental care in protecting children from suffering or death. These experiences of vulnerability, which contrasted with the intellectual confidence that his education was designed to instill, would later influence his philosophical emphasis on accepting uncertainty and finding meaning in temporary relationships and provisional insights rather than permanent achievements or absolute knowledge. The seasonal rhythms that govern life at the Chateau taught Michel to appreciate both constancy and change as natural features of existence that require different responses at different times. The same estate that provided security and continuity also demonstrated how external circumstances could require adaptation and flexibility that rigid adherence to established routines would make impossible. Michel de Montaigne was learning that education could cultivate judgment and refine sensibility while remaining powerless to eliminate the fundamental uncertainties that made human existence both challenging and interesting. The humanist son would eventually discover that his privileged education had prepared him not for certainty about important questions, but for sophisticated appreciation of their complexity, and that this might be the most valuable preparation possible for a life devoted to honest reflection about human nature and the conditions that make flourishing possible. Chapter 2. The Bordeaux Years. In 1557, 24-year-old Michel de Montaigne took his oath as a councillor in the Parliament of Bordeaux, beginning a legal career that would provide him with practical education in human nature while demonstrating the gap between institutional ideals and administrative realities that would profoundly influence his philosophical development. The Parliament was not merely a court of law, but the governing body for one of France's most important provinces, responsible for both judicial decisions and administrative oversight that affected thousands of lives across southwestern France. The daily routines of legal practice exposed Montaigne to the infinite variety of human motivations and circumstances that made abstract principles difficult to apply consistently. Civil disputes, criminal cases, and administrative appeals brought before the court revealed how similar situations could require different responses depending on particular circumstances that general rules could not anticipate. This experience taught him to distrust systematic approaches to complex problems, while appreciating the practical wisdom that came from careful attention to specific details, rather than theoretical consistency. His colleagues in the Parliament included some of the most learned men in France, individuals who combined legal expertise with humanistic scholarship and practical experience in governance. Their conversations, which extended far beyond immediate professional concerns, provided intellectual stimulation and models for combining scholarly learning with civic responsibility. Yet Montaigne also observed how professional success could corrupt good intentions and how institutional pressures could gradually compromise personal integrity in ways that individuals might not recognize until damage was irreversible. The legal education that had prepared Montaigne for his judicial responsibilities emphasized rhetorical skill and logical analysis that served him well in court proceedings while revealing the limitations of purely rational approaches to human problems. The most sophisticated legal arguments could be undermined by emotional appeals, while the most logically sound decisions might prove impractical or unjust when applied to particular circumstances that lawmakers had not anticipated. The friendship that Montaigne developed with Tien de la Bataille during their service together in the Parliament provided the most intellectually and emotionally satisfying relationship of his life, while introducing him to political theories that challenged conventional assumptions about authority and obedience. La Bataille's essay on voluntary servitude analyzed how people collaborate in their own oppression by accepting hierarchies that serve elite interests rather than common welfare, but their friendship was based on shared love of literature and philosophy rather than political ideology. Their intellectual collaboration included ambitious projects for translating classical texts and writing political analyses that might contribute to better governance, but more importantly, it provided Montaigne with experience of perfect friendship that classical authors had described but that he had not previously encountered. The harmony of minds and temperaments that characterized their relationship became his standard for meaningful human connection, while demonstrating how rare such compatibility actually was among even educated and well-intentioned individuals. The religious conflicts that increasingly dominated French political life during Montaigne's years in Bordeaux provided practical education in how theological differences could generate political violence that destroyed communities and corrupted individuals regardless of their original spiritual motivations. Catholics and Protestants who had previously coexisted peacefully became enemies willing to use any means necessary to achieve religious objectives that they considered more important than civil order or personal relationships. The administrative responsibilities that came with judicial office required Montaigne to make decisions about taxation, military recruitment, and commercial regulation that affected people's daily lives while revealing how difficult it was to achieve good outcomes through governmental action. Even when officials were competent and well-intentioned, the gap between policy intentions and practical results taught him to be skeptical about ambitious reform programs while appreciating the modest improvements that careful attention to administrative details could sometimes achieve. His observations of courtroom proceedings provided psychological education in how people behaved under pressure while revealing the complex relationships between truth, justice, and practical necessity that made legal decisions more art than science. Witnesses lied, lawyers manipulated evidence, and judges faced impossible choices between competing claims that could not be reconciled through purely rational analysis. These experiences reinforced his conviction that moral judgment required practical wisdom rather than theoretical consistency. The social obligations that accompanied his professional position exposed Montaigne to the elaborate courtesies and hidden competitions that characterized aristocratic culture, while providing opportunities to observe how public roles could conflict with private convictions in ways that gradually corrupted character or created psychological tensions that made authentic self-expression increasingly difficult. The financial considerations that influenced judicial appointments and legal decisions taught Montaigne how economic interests could shape supposedly objective institutional processes, while demonstrating the practical limitations that constrained even well-intentioned efforts to achieve justice or promote common welfare. Money did not determine all outcomes, but it influenced enough of them to make purely idealistic approaches to legal and political questions naive and potentially counterproductive. The death of La Bataille in 1563 created personal grief that lasted for decades while providing philosophical insight into the temporary nature of all human relationships and the isolation that ultimately characterizes individual existence. Losing his closest friend taught Montaigne that even perfect love could not overcome mortality, and that wisdom required accepting loss while finding meaning in temporary connections rather than permanent achievements. The political tensions that culminated in religious warfare during the 1560s made Montaigne's position increasingly difficult as competing factions demanded loyalty while official neutrality became practically impossible to maintain. His attempts to serve judicial rather than partisan interests brought criticism from both Catholics and Protestants, while demonstrating how external conflicts could make institutional integrity impossible to preserve, regardless of personal intentions or professional competence. The intellectual projects that Montaigne pursued during his leisure time, including translation work and political writing, provided outlets for scholarly interests while failing to achieve the literary success or cultural influence that his humanistic education had led him to expect. These disappointments taught him that talent and effort did not guarantee achievement, while suggesting that different approaches to intellectual work might prove more personally satisfying, even if they attracted less public recognition. The gradual recognition that legal and political careers offered limited opportunities for the kind of intellectual development and moral growth that Montaigne considered most important began creating psychological tensions that would eventually motivate his retirement from public life. Professional success was providing social recognition and financial security, while failing to address deeper questions about meaning and purpose that his education had taught him to consider essential for human flourishing. Michel de Montaigne was discovering that institutional life, however necessary for social order and individual security, might be incompatible with the kind of honest self-examination and intellectual independence that his classical education had taught him to value above conventional measures of success. The Bordeaux years were preparing him for the retreat into private reflection that would produce his greatest literary achievements, while teaching him that public service and personal authenticity might require different approaches to life that could not easily be reconciled. Chapter 3: The Perfect Friend. The friendship between Michel de Montaigne and Etienne de la Bataille began in the chambers of the Bordeaux Parliament sometime in 1558 and would become, In Montaigne's words, a relationship so perfect that our souls mingle and blend with each other so completely that they efface the seam that joined them and cannot find it again. This was not the casual camaraderie that developed among colleagues, nor the strategic alliance that ambitious men cultivate for professional advancement, but something that classical authors had described and that Montaigne had read about without believing he would ever experience: complete intellectual and emotional harmony between two independent minds. La Bataille was 18 months older than Montaigne and had already established a reputation for brilliance that made him one of the most promising young men in southwestern France. His essay on voluntary servitude, written when he was barely 20, analyzed the psychological mechanisms through which people accept political oppression with a sophistication that would influence political theory for centuries. But what attracted Montaigne was not La Bataille's intellectual achievements, but the quality of mind that produced them, a combination of analytical rigor and moral sensitivity that Montaigne recognized as reflecting his own deepest aspirations for what thinking could become. Their first substantial conversation revealed the mysterious compatibility that would define their relationship. They discovered that they had read the same books, reached similar conclusions about difficult questions, and shared assumptions about literature and life that they had not previously found in other people. More remarkably, they disagreed about important matters without the intellectual pride or personal defensiveness that usually makes disagreement a source of tension rather than illumination. Each could correct the other's errors while learning from criticism in ways that enhanced rather than threatened their mutual respect. The intellectual projects that they undertook together provided practical experience of collaborative thinking that achieved insights neither could have reached independently. Their translation work on classical texts required not just linguistic expertise, but shared judgment about how ancient ideas could be made accessible to contemporary readers without losing philosophical precision or aesthetic elegance. These projects taught Montaigne that genuine friendship could enhance individual intellectual capacity while remaining respectful of personal differences. That made collaboration interesting rather than merely efficient. Their correspondence during periods when professional duties kept them apart revealed the depth of emotional connection that accompanied their intellectual partnership. Letters that began with discussions of legal cases or literary questions would develop into meditations on friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning that educated men pursued despite the practical demands that consumed most of their time and energy. These exchanges provided Montaigne with models for the kind of honest self-examination that would later characterize his essays. La Bataille's marriage in 1561 created new dynamics in his relationship with Montaigne while demonstrating how friendship could accommodate rather than compete with other forms of love, when both parties understood that different relationships serve different human needs. Montaigne developed genuine affection for La Bataille's wife, while recognizing that marriage necessarily changed the conditions of their friendship without destroying its essential character. This experience taught him about the complex negotiations that intimate relationships require and the maturity that makes such negotiations successful rather than destructive. The political theories that La Bataille developed in his published and unpublished writings provided intellectual foundation for conversations that helped Montaigne understand how individual moral development and collective social organization could be mutually supportive rather than competing claims on human attention and energy. La Bataille's analysis of power and authority complemented Montaigne's practical observations about legal and administrative procedures while suggesting possibilities for reform that would enhance rather than threaten individual liberty and cultural diversity. Their shared love of Plutarch's moral philosophy provided common vocabulary for discussing questions about character, virtue, and practical wisdom that occupied much of their private conversation while influencing their approaches to professional responsibilities and personal relationships. Plutarch's biographical studies of ancient leaders offered models for how intellectual sophistication could be combined with practical effectiveness in ways that enhanced rather than compromised moral integrity. The recreational activities that they enjoyed together, reading, conversation, travel, and participation in the cultural life of Bordeaux, demonstrated how friendship could transform ordinary pleasures into sources of deeper satisfaction, while providing relief from professional pressures that might otherwise become overwhelming. Their companionship made routine activities more meaningful while creating memories that would sustain Montaigne through decades of subsequent reflection. La Boétie's growing reputation as a political theorist and potential future leader created external pressures that tested their friendship while revealing its genuine character. Professional jealousy or competitive ambition could have poisoned their relationship. But instead, Montaigne felt only pride in his friend's achievements, while La Boétie remained genuinely interested in Montaigne's intellectual development despite his own growing public recognition. This mutual generosity taught Montaigne about the psychological conditions that make lasting friendship possible among talented individuals. The philosophical discussions that occupied their leisure time explored questions about skepticism, Stoicism, and the relationship between ancient wisdom and contemporary problems that would later provide foundation for Montaigne's mature thinking. La Boétie's more systematic approach to philosophical questions complemented Montaigne's tendency toward empirical observation and psychological analysis, while both men remained committed to practical wisdom rather than abstract theoretical consistency. The personal habits and daily routines that they shared or observed in each other provided intimate knowledge of character that went far beyond public persona or professional achievement. Montaigne learned how La Boétie responded to illness, disappointment, success, and routine domestic circumstances that revealed temperament and values more clearly than formal occasions or prepared speeches. This knowledge created the foundation of trust that made complete intellectual and emotional honesty possible between them. The literary tastes and aesthetic judgments that they developed through shared reading and discussion taught Montaigne about the relationship between artistic appreciation and moral sensitivity, while providing standards for evaluating cultural productions that would influence his later writing. La Boétie's ear for language and eye for literary quality helped refine Montaigne's own developing sense of style while demonstrating how aesthetic education could contribute to practical wisdom and ethical development. The gradual recognition that their friendship represented something extraordinary that most people never experience created both gratitude and anxiety about its fragility. Montaigne began to understand how dependent his happiness had become on this relationship, while learning to appreciate its present reality without taking its continuation for granted. This psychological education in the temporary nature of all human connections would prove essential preparation for the loss that was approaching. Etienne de la Boétie had given Michel de Montaigne a standard for human relationship that would influence all his subsequent thinking about friendship, love, and the possibilities for genuine understanding between individuals. Their perfect friendship provided experiential foundation for philosophical insights about human nature and social connection that would later enable Montaigne to write about these subjects with authority that came from lived experience rather than theoretical speculation. Chapter 4. Loss and Literature. On August 18, 1563, Etienne de la Boétie died of dysentery in Montaigne's arms, ending the most important relationship of Montaigne's life and creating a void that would never be filled but would eventually become the source of his greatest literary achievements. The death was protracted and painful, lasting several days during which La Boétie remained conscious and lucid enough to discuss his approaching end with the same intellectual honesty and emotional control that had characterized their friendship. For Montaigne, watching his closest friend die provided education in human mortality that no amount of reading classical philosophy could have supplied. La Boétie's final conversations revealed the quality of mind and character that had made their friendship so extraordinary while demonstrating how philosophical preparation for death could provide practical resources for facing the ultimate human challenge with dignity rather than despair. He spoke about his fears and regrets with the same analytical precision he had applied to political questions, while maintaining concern for Montaigne's future welfare that transcended personal anxiety about his own approaching dissolution. The practical arrangements that La Boétie made for his manuscripts and personal effects included provisions that would shape Montaigne's subsequent literary career. He bequeathed his library to Montaigne, along with explicit encouragement to continue the intellectual projects they had discussed while developing his own distinctive approaches to questions that their conversations had explored but not resolved. This literary inheritance carried both opportunity and obligation that would influence Montaigne's eventual decision to become a writer. The grief that followed La Boétie's death was unlike anything Montaigne had previously experienced and would prove more lasting and transformative than ordinary mourning for deceased family members or respected colleagues. He had lost not just a friend, but the person who understood him most completely and who provided the intellectual companionship that made his own thinking possible. The isolation that resulted from this loss taught him about the essential loneliness that characterizes human existence. Despite our capacity for temporary connection with others, the editing and publication of La Bataille's posthumous works provided Montaigne with his first serious literary project, while creating occasions for reflection on the relationship between life and literature that would later influence his approach to autobiographical writing. Preparing his friend's texts for publication required decisions about what should be shared with the public and what should remain private, introducing questions about the ethics of literary representation that would later shape his own self-revelatory essays. The letters of condolence that Montaigne received from friends and acquaintances revealed the social conventions that governed responses to death, while failing to address the psychological reality of loss that defied conventional comfort or philosophical consolation. These well-intentioned but inadequate responses taught him about the limitations of language for communicating deep emotional experience and the necessity of finding more authentic forms of expression for experiences that conventional discourse could not accommodate. His attempts to fill the intellectual void left by La Bataille's death included intensified reading of classical authors and contemporary writers who might provide companionship or guidance for navigating life without the perfect friend who had made existence meaningful in ways that Montaigne was only beginning to understand. But books, however wise or beautiful, could not provide the kind of interactive intellectual stimulation that had made his friendship with La Bataille so essential to his psychological well-being. The professional responsibilities that continued demanding Montaigne's attention despite his personal grief provided unwelcome but necessary distraction from mourning, while demonstrating how public life could become psychologically intolerable when it lacked connection to deeper sources of meaning and purpose. Legal work that had previously seemed important now felt mechanical and pointless, contributing to his growing dissatisfaction with careers that served social functions without addressing individual needs for authentic self-expression. The social obligations that required Montaigne to participate in ordinary conversation and recreational activities while he was still mourning created new appreciation for the masks that people wear to conceal their inner lives from others who lack the time, interest, or emotional capacity for genuine understanding. He learned to function socially while maintaining private awareness of feelings and thoughts that public roles made it impossible to express authentically. The philosophical questions that La Bataille's death raised about mortality, meaning, and the value of human relationships led Montaigne to renewed study of Stoic literature while revealing the limitations of theoretical approaches to problems that could only be resolved through lived experience and practical wisdom. Reading Seneca's letters about dealing with loss provided intellectual framework for understanding grief, without eliminating the emotional reality that made philosophical consolation seem inadequate or even offensive. The literary experiments that Montaigne began during this period of mourning included attempts to write about his friendship with La Bataille in ways that could preserve its memory while communicating its significance to readers who had not known either man personally. These early efforts taught him about the challenges of transforming private experience into public discourse without losing authenticity or descending into sentimentality that would betray the intellectual standards that his friendship had represented. The correspondence that Montaigne maintained with La Bataille's widow and other mutual friends provided ongoing connections to his deceased friend's memory while demonstrating how relationships could continue in modified forms after death through shared commitment to values and interests that survived individual mortality. These connections were precious, but also painful, serving as constant reminders of what had been lost while offering glimpses of what might be preserved through conscious effort. The gradual recognition that his grief for La Bataille was becoming a permanent feature of his psychological landscape rather than a temporary emotional disruption led Montaigne to consider how loss might be transformed into creative energy that could honor his friend's memory while addressing his own need for meaningful intellectual work. This insight would eventually provide motivation for the literary career that would make La Bataille's influence on Montaigne visible to future generations. The decision to preserve and publish La Bataille's minor works alongside his own early literary efforts represented Montaigne's first step toward the kind of autobiographical writing that would eventually produce the essays. By presenting his friends' texts within frameworks that explained their personal significance, Montaigne began developing methods for combining objective analysis with subjective reflection that would become his distinctive contribution to Renaissance literature. The memorial essay that Montaigne eventually wrote about his friendship with La Bataille established the literary techniques and philosophical approaches that would characterize his mature work while providing permanent testimony to a relationship that had taught him about the possibilities and limitations of human connection. Of Friendship would become one of his most influential essays while serving as literary monument to the man whose death had made Montaigne a writer. Etienne de la Bataille's death had taught Michel de Montaigne that loss could become a source of literary creation, and that private grief could be transformed into public wisdom when approached with appropriate intellectual honesty and artistic skill. The perfect friend who had died would live forever in the essays that his absence had made necessary, and that his memory would continue to inspire. Chapter 5. The retreat to the Tower on February 28, 1571, his 38th birthday. Michel de Montaigne made a decision that would transform him from a successful provincial magistrate into one of history's most influential writers. He resigned from the Parliament of Bordeaux, liquidated most of his public obligations, and retreated to his family estate to begin what he described as a study of himself that would occupy the remaining 21 years of his life. The inscription he had carved into the wooden beams of his library announced his intention to spend whatever time remained to him in freedom, tranquility, and leisure, devoted to the pursuit of self-knowledge rather than public recognition or professional advancement. The decision to abandon his legal career was not the result of any specific disappointment or failure, but rather the culmination of years of growing dissatisfaction with the gap between institutional ideals and administrative realities that made public service increasingly difficult for someone whose classical education had taught him to value intellectual integrity above social conformity. The religious wars that were tearing France apart had made neutral professional service nearly impossible, while revealing how political pressures could corrupt even well-intentioned individuals who attempted to maintain objective judgment in partisan environments. The Tower Library, that became Montaigne's primary retreat, was a circular room on the third floor of the medieval fortification that had been converted into his family's residence. The space was lined with nearly 1,000 books, representing the best of classical and contemporary learning, but more importantly, it provided the physical and psychological isolation necessary for the kind of sustained self-examination that Montaigne intended to pursue. The room's windows offered views of the surrounding countryside, while its thick stone walls created silence that made concentrated thinking possible. The daily routines that Montaigne established in his retirement reflected both the leisure that his social position made possible and the intellectual discipline that serious study required. Mornings were devoted to reading and reflection, afternoons to physical exercise and estate management, evenings to correspondence and preliminary writing. This schedule provided structure for what might otherwise have become aimless amateur scholarship while maintaining the flexibility that genuine intellectual investigation acquired rather than rigid academic systematization. The intellectual projects that initially occupied Montaigne's attention included editing La Bataille's posthumous works and translating classical texts that might contribute to contemporary debates about politics and morality. But gradually, he discovered that his most interesting observations emerged not from scholarly commentary on other authors' ideas, but from analysis of his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences that revealed patterns and contradictions that more systematic approaches to human nature typically overlooked. The philosophical reading that provided foundation for Montaigne's mature thinking emphasized skeptical traditions that questioned rather than affirmed systematic knowledge, while offering practical wisdom for navigating uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Sextus Empiricus's ancient arguments against dogmatic philosophy combined with Cicero's academic questions to provide intellectual framework for doubt that was constructive rather than destructive, leading toward practical wisdom rather than theoretical despair. The notebooks that Montaigne began keeping during his early retirement reveal the gradual development of his distinctive literary voice and philosophical perspective through hundreds of brief observations about books, people, events, and personal experiences that would eventually provide raw material for the essays. These fragmentary reflections demonstrated how sustained attention to ordinary experience could yield insights that more ambitious theoretical investigations might miss through their commitment to systematic completeness. The correspondence that connected Montaigne to intellectual communities beyond his provincial estate provided stimulation and feedback that prevented his retreat from becoming mere escapism while maintaining the independence that made authentic self-examination possible. Letters to and from humanist scholars throughout Europe created informal networks of learning that transcended national boundaries and institutional affiliations while respecting individual intellectual autonomy. The estate management responsibilities that continued claiming portions of Montaigne's attention provided practical education in human nature and social organization that complemented his theoretical reading while preventing his intellectual work from becoming completely divorced from worldly concerns. Supervising agricultural operations, settling tenant disputes, and managing financial affairs taught him about the gap between abstract principles and particular circumstances that would later inform his skeptical approach to moral and political philosophy. The family relationships that shaped Montaigne's domestic environment during his retirement included his marriage to Françoise de la Chassagne, which provided companionship and social stability while remaining psychologically and intellectually secondary to his scholarly pursuits. His wife managed household affairs and raised their children while respecting his need for solitude and independence that might have seemed selfish to women with different expectations about marriage and family obligations. The births and deaths of several children during this period provided intimate education in human frailty and the limits of parental care, while reinforcing Montaigne's growing conviction that accepting uncertainty and loss was more practical than attempting to control outcomes that ultimately depended on forces beyond individual influence. These personal experiences informed his later writing about parenting, education, and the relationship between love and detachment that wisdom required. The local political responsibilities that Montaigne could not completely avoid despite his official retirement demonstrated how public and private life remained interconnected even for individuals who attempted to withdraw from institutional involvement. Requests for advice, mediation of disputes, and informal consultation about provincial affairs continued connecting him to contemporary events while allowing him to maintain critical distance from partisan commitments that might compromise intellectual independence. The gradual recognition that his private investigations were producing insights that might be worth sharing with other readers led Montaigne to begin transforming his notebooks into literary essays that could communicate self-knowledge in ways that might prove useful for other people engaged in similar projects of moral and intellectual development. This transition from private reflection to public writing would require developing methods for presenting subjective experience in forms that achieved universal relevance without losing personal authenticity. The physical and psychological benefits that resulted from Montaigne's retreat to scholarly leisure included improved health, greater emotional equilibrium, and intellectual satisfaction that professional success had never provided. The library tower became a sanctuary that enabled forms of thinking and self-examination that the pressures of public life had made impossible while demonstrating that retirement could be creative rather than merely escapist when approached with appropriate intellectual ambitions. The inscription that Montaigne added to his library beams during this period, "Que sais-je? What do I know?" summarized the epistemological humility that would characterize his mature philosophical position, while providing constant reminder that intellectual honesty required acknowledgement of ignorance rather than claims to systematic knowledge that experience could not support. Michel de Montaigne's retreat to the Tower had created the conditions necessary for the literary and philosophical achievements that would make him immortal while demonstrating how private leisure could serve public purposes when devoted to honest investigation of questions that transcended individual circumstances. The withdrawal from public life had become preparation for a different kind of contribution to human understanding that would prove more lasting than any political or professional success he might have achieved through conventional ambition. Chapter 6. The Birth of the Essay. In 1572, sometime during the quiet months of his early retirement, Michel de Montaigne began writing something that had never existed before in European literature, short prose pieces that he called essay attempts, which captured the actual movement of a mind thinking through problems without rushing toward predetermined conclusions or systematic solutions. The word essay would become one of French literature's most important gifts to world culture, but Montaigne invented the form gradually, almost accidentally, as he searched for ways to express insights that conventional academic or literary genres could not accommodate. The model that Montaigne initially had in mind came from classical antiquity, The moral essays of Seneca and Plutarch, which combined philosophical reflection with practical wisdom in relatively brief, accessible pieces that educated readers could enjoy without specialized training in technical philosophy. But where ancient moralists typically presented their insights as settled wisdom derived from established philosophical schools, Montaigne offered something more tentative and personal: the record of his own thinking process as he worked through questions that had no definitive answers. The freedom from systematic constraints that retirement had provided enabled Montaigne to write about whatever captured his attention without worrying about disciplinary boundaries or theoretical consistency that academic work typically required. He could move from observations about his reading to memories of childhood experiences to speculations about human nature without maintaining the logical rigor that formal philosophy demanded, but that seemed artificial when applied to the actual complexity of lived experience. The conversational tone that distinguished Montaigne's early essays from more formal literary and philosophical writing reflected his conviction that thinking was most productive when it remained flexible and responsive, rather than committed to defending particular positions or advancing systematic arguments. He wrote as if addressing a friend who shared his interests and intellectual background, but who might disagree with his conclusions without threatening their relationship or questioning his competence. The subject matter that occupied Montaigne's first essays revealed the range of interests that retirement had allowed him to pursue without professional constraints. He wrote about friendship and solitude, reading and travel, ancient history and contemporary politics, medical theories and educational practices, with the same serious attention to detail and nuanced judgment that he had previously devoted to legal cases or administrative decisions. Everything that affected human experience seemed worthy of careful consideration and thoughtful analysis. The literary techniques that Montaigne developed to capture the movement of his own thinking included digression, qualification, and self-correction that made his prose feel spontaneous and natural, rather than carefully crafted according to rhetorical principles. He would begin discussing one topic, notice connections to other questions, pursue those tangents until they led to unexpected insights, then return to his original subject with deeper understanding than systematic analysis might have provided. The psychological self-analysis that became increasingly prominent in Montaigne's essays reflected his conviction that understanding himself might prove more valuable than studying external subjects that other authors had already investigated thoroughly. His own thoughts, feelings, habits, and contradictions provided unlimited material for investigation while offering insights into human nature that purely theoretical approaches to psychology could not achieve. The skeptical philosophy that provided intellectual framework for Montaigne's approach to all questions emphasized the limitations of human knowledge rather than its achievements, while suggesting that acknowledging ignorance might be the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of inquiry. This perspective allowed him to explore complex subjects without claiming authority or finality that experience had taught him was impossible for finite beings to achieve. The editing process that Montaigne applied to his early essays revealed his growing understanding of how to transform private reflection into public discourse without losing authenticity or descending into mere self-indulgence. He learned to select personal experiences and observations that would interest other readers while maintaining the honesty and specificity that made his writing distinctive rather than conventional. The feedback that Montaigne received from friends who read his early essays encouraged him to continue developing this new form of writing while providing suggestions about how to make his work accessible to readers who did not share his classical education or intellectual background. These informal responses taught him about the difference between writing for himself and writing for audiences who needed more context and explanation than private reflection required. The first collected edition of Montaigne's essays, published in 1580, contained 94 pieces that demonstrated the range and flexibility of the genre he had created while establishing his reputation as one of France's most original literary voices. The book's success proved that readers were hungry for alternatives to conventional didactic literature that offered genuine insight into human nature rather than moral instruction based on abstract principles. The printing process that transformed Montaigne's manuscripts into published books provided practical education in how written work changed meaning when it moved from private notebooks to public circulation. Seeing his thoughts in print taught him about the permanent character that publication gave to ideas that had emerged from particular circumstances and might require revision as his understanding developed through continued experience and reflection. The critical responses that Montaigne's essays received from contemporary readers revealed both appreciation for their originality and concern about their departure from established literary and philosophical conventions. Some critics praised his honesty and insight, while others worried about the moral implications of such thoroughgoing skepticism and individualistic self-examination that seemed to challenge traditional sources of authority and social stability. The influence that Montaigne's early essays had on other writers demonstrated the appeal of literary forms that could combine intellectual sophistication with personal authenticity in ways that purely academic or purely autobiographical writing could not achieve. Authors throughout Europe began experimenting with similar approaches to reflective prose, while recognizing Montaigne as having established new possibilities for serious literary expression. The continued revision and expansion of his essays throughout the 1580s showed how Montaigne understood his writing as ongoing exploration rather than completed achievement, constantly adding new material and refining earlier formulations. As his self-understanding developed through continued living and thinking, the essays became a living document that grew and changed along with their author, rather than fixed statements of settled conclusions. Michel de Montaigne had invented the literary essay as a vehicle for honest self-examination that could achieve universal relevance through particular personal investigation, demonstrating how individual consciousness could become a lens for understanding human nature generally while maintaining respect for the complexity and mystery that made systematic knowledge impossible, but practical wisdom achievable through sustained attention and intellectual humility. Chapter 7. The Politics of Moderation. In 1581, the citizens of Bordeaux elected Michel de Montaigne as their mayor, drawing him reluctantly back into public life at a time when France was being torn apart by religious warfare that made political neutrality nearly impossible and administrative competence insufficient for addressing crises that transcended normal governmental solutions. Montaigne accepted the position with characteristic ambivalence, recognizing both his obligation to serve the common good and his skepticism about what political action could achieve when underlying social conflicts reflected irreconcilable differences about fundamental questions of religious truth and political authority. The mayorship of Bordeaux was no ceremonial position, but the chief executive office of one of France's most important cities, responsible for maintaining public order, managing commercial affairs, and mediating between competing religious and political factions that threatened to tear the community apart. The position required diplomatic skills, administrative competence, and physical courage in roughly equal measure, as officials faced constant danger from extremists who considered moderation a form of betrayal rather than political wisdom. The religious conflicts that dominated French politics during Montaigne's tenure reflected deeper cultural transformations that made traditional approaches to governance inadequate for addressing challenges that combined theological disagreements with economic grievances and regional autonomy. Movements. Catholics and Protestants were not merely disputing doctrinal questions, but competing for political power and economic resources in zero-sum conflicts that made compromise seem impossible to partisans while remaining essential for social survival. The political philosophy that guided Montaigne's approach to municipal governance emphasized practical problem-solving rather than ideological consistency while maintaining respect for individual conscience and cultural diversity that made religious coexistence possible despite theological disagreements. He attempted to create conditions where different communities could pursue their own religious practices without interfering with others' similar rights, an approach that satisfied neither militant Catholics nor zealous Protestants but preserved civic peace. The administrative challenges that confronted Bordeaux during this period included food shortages, plague outbreaks, military threats, and economic disruption that required immediate practical responses regardless of their long-term political implications. Montaigne's legal training and administrative experience proved valuable for addressing technical problems, while his philosophical skepticism helped him avoid the dogmatic approaches that might have exacerbated rather than resolved urgent practical difficulties. The diplomatic responsibilities that came with municipal leadership required Montaigne to negotiate with royal officials, provincial governors, and religious leaders who represented competing interests while maintaining Bordeaux's autonomy and commercial prosperity. These negotiations taught him about the complex relationships between local and national politics, while demonstrating how individual leadership could influence outcomes even when larger historical forces seemed to determine general directions. The personal costs that public service imposed on Montaigne included interruption of his literary work, exposure to physical danger, and psychological stress that resulted from making decisions that affected thousands of lives while remaining uncertain about their long-term consequences. The mayoralty provided practical education in the limitations of political action while confirming his conviction that private reflection and public service required different approaches to moral and intellectual problems. The military threats that Bordeaux faced during Montaigne's tenure included both foreign invasion and domestic rebellion that tested his abilities as a political leader while providing first-hand experience of how warfare corrupted social relationships and individual character, regardless of the justice of particular causes. Managing municipal defenses taught him about the practical requirements for maintaining social order while revealing the moral costs that security measures imposed on civilian populations. The religious riots that erupted periodically in Bordeaux and other French cities demonstrated how theological differences could generate political violence that destroyed communities while serving no constructive purposes that rational analysis could identify. Montaigne's efforts to prevent such outbreaks required constant attention to the psychological dynamics that transformed religious conviction into social hatred while maintaining respect for genuine spiritual concerns that motivated most participants. The economic policies that Montaigne implemented during his mayoralty reflected his understanding that commercial prosperity and social stability were mutually dependent while requiring governmental intervention that balanced private interests with public welfare. Municipal regulation of trade, taxation, and public works provided practical experience in how policy decisions affected different social groups, while revealing the complexity of achieving outcomes that served common rather than factional interests. The correspondence that Montaigne maintained during his mayoralty with political leaders throughout France provided insights into national politics while demonstrating how local and regional concerns influenced larger policy decisions. These exchanges taught him about the informal networks that actually govern the country, while revealing how personal relationships and mutual trust could sometimes achieve results that formal institutional procedures could not accomplish. The judicial responsibilities that occasionally required Montaigne to make legal decisions as municipal magistrate provided opportunities to apply his earlier legal training while testing his philosophical convictions about justice and mercy in practical situations, where abstract principles had to be adapted to particular circumstances involving real people whose lives would be affected by his judgments. The public ceremonies and official entertainments that mayoral duties required provided education in the symbolic dimensions of political leadership, while demonstrating how ritual and spectacle could serve legitimate governmental purposes when used to reinforce social solidarity rather than manipulate popular opinion for partisan advantage. Managing public celebrations taught him about the relationship between political authority and cultural expression. The recognition that successful municipal governance required forms of practical wisdom that could not be derived from theoretical political philosophy led Montaigne to appreciate the value of empirical observation and flexible response to changing circumstances, rather than rigid adherence to systematic principles that might prove inadequate when applied to complex real-world problems requiring immediate decisions based on incomplete information. The decision to accept re-election for a second term as mayor demonstrated Montaigne's commitment to public service while revealing his growing confidence in approaches to political leadership that emphasized competence and integrity rather than ideological purity or partisan advantage. His success in maintaining civic peace during turbulent times established his reputation as a political moderate whose skeptical philosophy could provide practical guidance for governance in difficult circumstances. The eventual completion of his mayoral service in 1585 allowed Montaigne to return to private life with enhanced appreciation for both the possibilities and limitations of political action, while providing practical experience that would inform his later writing about governance, authority, and the relationship between individual conscience and social responsibility that remained one of his most important contributions to political philosophy. Michel de Montaigne's experience as mayor of Bordeaux had demonstrated how philosophical skepticism could serve practical political purposes when combined with administrative competence and moral integrity, showing that intellectual honesty and political effectiveness were compatible, rather than contradictory approaches to public service that could preserve social order while respecting individual liberty and cultural diversity. Chapter 8. The Journey to Rome. In June 1580, at the age of 47, Michel de Montaigne embarked on a 17-month journey through France, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy that would provide him with direct experience of cultural diversity and religious difference, while testing his philosophical convictions about human nature against empirical observation of how people actually lived in circumstances very different from his own provincial French background. The trip was officially motivated by medical concerns. Montaigne suffered from kidney stones and hoped that Italian spa treatments might provide relief, but the detailed travel journal he kept reveals deeper motivations related to his intellectual curiosity about the varieties of human experience. The decision to travel extensively for the first time in his life reflected Montaigne's growing conviction that book learning, however sophisticated, could not substitute for direct observation of the world's complexity, and that his essays would benefit from broader empirical foundation than his relatively narrow provincial experience could provide. The journey would expose him to different political systems, religious practices, social customs, and individual character types that might confirm or challenge the generalizations about human nature that he had been developing through self-examination and classical reading. The practical arrangements for the journey revealed both Montaigne's social status and his intellectual priorities, as he traveled with servants and considerable financial resources while carrying minimal baggage, except for books and writing materials that would enable him to continue his literary work during periods of rest and recovery. The combination of aristocratic comfort with scholarly purpose reflected his understanding that serious intellectual investigation required both leisure and diverse experience that wealth could facilitate but not guarantee. The route that Montaigne chose took him through regions that would provide maximum exposure to cultural and religious diversity, while including the Italian destinations that educated Europeans considered essential for complete humanistic formation. The journey was designed as much for education as for medical treatment, with detours to visit famous libraries, meet distinguished scholars, and observe political and religious institutions that differed significantly from French practices. The travel journal that Montaigne kept during this period, written partly in French and partly in Italian as his linguistic skills developed, provides unprecedented insight into how his mind worked when confronted with new experiences, while revealing the observational skills and psychological curiosity that made him such an acute analyst of human behavior. The journal demonstrates how travel could become a form of philosophical investigation when approached with appropriate intellectual preparation and moral sensitivity. The medical treatments that Montaigne pursued at various Italian spas provided practical education in Renaissance approaches to health and disease, while revealing the gap between medical theory and therapeutic effectiveness that paralleled similar problems in other fields where systematic knowledge claimed more certainty than empirical results could support. His descriptions of spa treatments combine scientific curiosity with skeptical evaluation of their actual benefits. The religious observances that Montaigne witnessed during his travels included both Protestant services in German cities and Catholic ceremonies in Italy that demonstrated the variety of Christian practice, while providing comparative perspective on French religious culture that made both similarities and differences more apparent than they would have been without such exposure to alternative approaches to spiritual expression and institutional organization. The political systems that Montaigne observed during his journey revealed different approaches to governance and social organization that challenged French assumptions about natural or necessary forms of authority, while demonstrating how cultural circumstances influenced institutional development in ways that made universal political principles difficult to identify or apply across different social contexts. The social customs and daily practices that varied dramatically from place to place provided Montaigne with evidence for his conviction that much of what people considered natural or necessary was actually conventional and contingent upon particular historical and cultural circumstances that could be changed through conscious effort or historical development, rather than being permanently fixed by human nature or divine command. The conversations with fellow travelers, local residents, and learned men that occupied much of Montaigne's time during the journey provided opportunities to test his ideas against other perspectives while practicing the kind of intellectual dialogue that had characterized his friendship with La Bataille, but that his retirement had made less available through ordinary social interaction in his home region. The libraries and private collections that Montaigne visited during his travels provided access to books and manuscripts that were not available in France, while demonstrating how intellectual communities maintained international connections that transcended national boundaries and religious differences through shared commitment to learning and cultural preservation that scholars considered more important than political or theological partisanship. The artistic and architectural monuments that Montaigne encountered during his Italian travels provided aesthetic education that complemented his literary and philosophical interests, while demonstrating how different cultures express their highest aspirations through visual arts that could communicate across linguistic barriers and historical periods in ways that purely verbal communication might not achieve. The linguistic challenges that confronted Montaigne as he attempted to communicate in Latin, Italian, and German tested his humanistic education while providing practical experience in how language barriers affected understanding and social interaction. His gradual development of conversational Italian demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of achieving genuine communication across cultural differences. The physical hardships and pleasures of extensive travel provided Montaigne with direct experience of how changing circumstances affected health, mood, and intellectual productivity, while testing his philosophical convictions about accepting what could not be controlled while taking appropriate responsibility for what remained within individual influence. Travel became a form of practical philosophy that complemented, but could not substitute for theoretical reflection. The papal audience that Montaigne received during his stay in Rome represented the climax of his Italian journey, while providing opportunity to observe the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority and ceremonial culture that shaped Catholic Christianity throughout Europe. His description of this encounter reveals both respect for institutional dignity and skeptical evaluation of claims to spiritual authority that characterized his approach to all systematic religious and political organizations. The decision to extend his journey beyond the originally planned duration reflected Montaigne's recognition that travel was providing forms of education and personal satisfaction that his retirement to scholarly leisure had not anticipated, while demonstrating how direct experience could complement rather than compete with literary and philosophical investigation as sources of practical wisdom about human nature and social organization. Michel de Montaigne's journey to Rome had provided empirical foundation for the cultural relativism and philosophical skepticism that would characterize his mature essays, while demonstrating how direct observation of human diversity could enhance rather than threaten intellectual and moral convictions when approached with appropriate combination of curiosity, critical judgment, and respect for complexity that systematic thinking typically attempted to eliminate or reduce to manageable abstractions. Chapter 9. The Wisdom of Age. By 1588, when Michel de Montaigne published the substantially expanded third edition of his essays, he had reached the intellectual and literary maturity that would establish his permanent reputation as one of the wisest voices in European culture. At 55, he possessed the accumulated experience of public service, private reflection, extensive travel, and sustained literary work that enabled him to write about human nature with authority that combined empirical observation with philosophical sophistication in ways that neither purely academic nor purely practical approaches to wisdom could achieve. The additions and revisions that Montaigne made to his earlier essays during this period revealed how his understanding of himself and human nature generally had deepened through continued living and thinking, while maintaining the intellectual humility that prevented his increased knowledge from becoming dogmatic certainty. He could correct his earlier observations without embarrassment, while acknowledging that his current insights might also require future modification, as experience provided additional evidence about questions that admitted no final answers. The essay of experience that Montaigne wrote during this period synthesized his mature understanding of how practical wisdom could be achieved through sustained attention to particular circumstances, rather than systematic application of general principles, demonstrating how individual self-knowledge could provide foundation for universal insights about the human condition, without claiming scientific precision or philosophical completeness that experience could not support. The psychological self-analysis that had become increasingly sophisticated in Montaigne's later essays revealed patterns of thought and behavior that he could observe with scientific detachment while accepting with compassionate understanding as characteristic features of his individual temperament, rather than moral failings that required correction or elimination. This integration of analytical intelligence with emotional acceptance would influence European approaches to psychology for centuries. The political reflections that occupied much of Montaigne's attention during the late 1580s drew on his experience as mayor of Bordeaux and his observations of French religious warfare to develop approaches to governance and social organization that emphasize practical problem-solving rather than ideological consistency, while maintaining respect for individual conscience and cultural diversity that made peaceful coexistence possible despite fundamental disagreements about ultimate questions. The religious investigations that Montaigne pursued during his final years revealed growing spiritual sophistication that could appreciate the value of institutional Christianity while maintaining critical distance from doctrinal claims and ecclesiastical authority that seemed to exceed what human reason could validate or practical experience could confirm. His approach to religious questions combined reverent skepticism with genuine spiritual seeking in ways that influenced subsequent development of both theology and secular philosophy. The literary techniques that Montaigne had perfected through years of essay writing enabled him to present complex ideas in prose that was simultaneously accessible to educated general readers and sophisticated enough to satisfy professional scholars, while maintaining the conversational intimacy that made his writing feel like personal correspondence rather than formal academic discourse. His mature style achieved the classical ideal of combining instruction with pleasure. The friendships that Montaigne developed during his later years provided intellectual companionship and emotional support that partially compensated for the loss of la beau tie, while demonstrating how mature relationships could achieve genuine intimacy without the perfect harmony that had characterized his youthful friendship. These later connections taught him about the different forms that human understanding could take while remaining valuable despite their limitations. The health problems that increasingly affected Montaigne during his 50s provided practical education in aging and physical decline, while testing his philosophical convictions about accepting what could not be controlled while taking appropriate responsibility for what remained within individual influence. His kidney stones and other ailments became subjects for essay writing that combined medical observation with moral reflection in ways that transformed personal suffering into literary achievement. The family relationships that shaped Montaigne's domestic environment during his final years included his continuing marriage to Françoise, the education of his surviving daughter, Eleanor, and the management of his estate that would provide financial security for future generations while preserving the library and study that had made his literary achievements possible. These responsibilities demonstrated how private intellectual work could be compatible with social obligations when approached with appropriate priorities. The literary reputation that Montaigne had achieved through successive editions of his essays provided recognition and influence that he had not sought, but that enabled him to contribute to contemporary debates about education, politics, and cultural questions, while maintaining the independence that authentic intellectual work required. Success had not corrupted his essential modesty or curiosity about questions that fame could not resolve. The pedagogical theories that Montaigne developed through reflection on his own education and observation of how learning actually occurred challenged conventional approaches to instruction while emphasizing the cultivation of judgment rather than the accumulation of information as the proper goal of educational effort. His insights about teaching and learning would influence educational reform movements for centuries while remaining relevant to contemporary discussions about how intellectual development should be fostered. The cultural criticism that occupied increasing attention in Montaigne's later essays analyzed how European civilization had developed both achievements and pathologies that revealed the complexity of human nature and social organization, while suggesting that progress was neither inevitable nor impossible, but required conscious effort and practical wisdom rather than systematic planning or theoretical consistency that historical experience had shown to be inadequate for addressing complex cultural problems. The historical consciousness that informed Montaigne's mature writing demonstrated how individual experience could provide insight into universal patterns of human behavior while respecting the particular circumstances that made each person and each historical period unique, rather than merely illustrative of general laws that claimed scientific authority but lacked empirical foundation adequate for making reliable predictions about future developments. The moral philosophy that emerged from Montaigne's later essays emphasized practical wisdom and compassionate understanding rather than systematic ethical theory, while maintaining standards of intellectual honesty and personal integrity that could guide individual behavior without claiming universal validity that different circumstances or temperaments might make inappropriate or impossible to achieve through conscious effort alone. Michel de Montaigne's mature wisdom represented the culmination of a lifetime devoted to honest self-examination and careful observation of human nature that had produced insights about the possibilities and limitations of individual understanding, while demonstrating how intellectual humility could serve practical purposes that systematic knowledge claimed but could not deliver through purely theoretical approaches to questions that required empirical investigation and personal experience for adequate comprehension. Chapter 10. Of Cannibals and Customs. In one of his most influential essays, Of Cannibals, written around 1580, Montaigne used reports about indigenous peoples of the New World to challenge European assumptions about civilization, barbarity, and human nature that revealed more about the prejudices of supposedly civilized observers than about the actual characteristics of the societies they claimed to understand. The essay demonstrated how careful philosophical analysis could transform contemporary ethnographic information into profound reflections on cultural relativism and moral judgment that would influence European thinking about colonialism, cultural difference, and the relationship between nature and society for centuries. The sources that Montaigne consulted for his information about Native American societies included travel accounts, personal conversations with individuals who had visited Brazil, and reports from French colonial administrators who had attempted to establish settlements in territories that indigenous peoples had occupied for centuries before European arrival. He approached these materials with characteristic skepticism about their reliability while using them to raise questions about European cultural practices that familiarity had made seem natural rather than conventional. The philosophical framework that Montaigne brought to his analysis of cultural difference drew on classical discussions of the relationship between nature and convention that enabled him to distinguish between human practices that reflected biological necessities and those that resulted from particular historical and social circumstances that could be changed through conscious effort or external influence. This analytical approach revealed assumptions about European superiority that could not be sustained through careful comparative investigation. The specific practices that Montaigne examined included warfare, marriage customs, religious ceremonies, and social organization among Brazilian indigenous peoples that differed dramatically from European equivalents while serving similar functional purposes in ways that suggested the possibility of alternative approaches to universal human problems, rather than evidence of moral or intellectual inferiority that colonial propaganda typically claimed. The rhetorical strategy that Montaigne employed in presenting his analysis involved systematic reversal of conventional judgments about which societies should be considered civilized and which barbarous, based on careful examination of actual behavior rather than theoretical claims about cultural achievement or moral development. He suggested that European practices of torture, religious persecution, and economic exploitation might be more truly barbarous than the customs that Europeans criticized in other societies. The economic observations that Montaigne included in his essay revealed how different societies organized production, distribution, and consumption in ways that achieved material prosperity and social stability through methods that challenged European assumptions about property, labor, and commercial exchange, while suggesting that market-based economies might not be natural or necessary features of human social organization, but particular historical developments. The linguistic evidence that Montaigne cited from travelers who had learned Native American languages demonstrated intellectual sophistication and cultural complexity that contradicted European stereotypes about primitive peoples, while providing examples of how different societies could achieve effective communication and cultural transmission through methods that differed significantly from European educational and literary practices without being less successful. The religious practices that Montaigne described among indigenous American societies revealed spiritual sophistication and moral sensitivity that challenged Christian claims about exclusive access to divine truth, while demonstrating how different cultures could address universal human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence through ceremonies and beliefs that achieved practical results without conforming to European theological categories or institutional structures. The political organization that Montaigne observed among Native American societies included forms of leadership, decision-making, and conflict resolution that achieved social order and collective action without the complex governmental apparatus that Europeans considered necessary for civilization, while suggesting that alternative approaches to authority and social coordination might be more effective than systematic political institutions. The environmental relationships that characterized indigenous American societies impressed Montaigne as demonstrating harmony between human communities and natural ecosystems that European agricultural and commercial practices had disrupted through approaches to land use that prioritized immediate economic advantage over long-term sustainability and ecological balance that indigenous methods seemed to achieve more successfully. The moral implications of Montaigne's comparative analysis extended beyond academic ethnography to fundamental questions about the ethics of colonialism and cultural imperialism that European expansion was imposing on societies that had developed effective solutions to human problems through methods that deserved respect rather than destruction through military conquest or religious conversion that served European interests rather than indigenous welfare. The epistemological questions that Montaigne raised about how Europeans could achieve reliable knowledge about other societies revealed the limitations of second-hand information and cultural prejudice, while demonstrating how philosophical skepticism could serve practical purposes in evaluating claims about human nature and social organization that reflected particular interests rather than universal truths that careful investigation could validate. The literary techniques that Montaigne employed in presenting his argument included ironic juxtaposition of European and indigenous practices that revealed contradictions in European moral judgment, while demonstrating how essay writing could serve purposes of cultural criticism and social reform rather than merely personal reflection or academic analysis that remained disconnected from contemporary political and moral issues. The historical significance of Montaigne's essay extended beyond its immediate impact on French intellectual culture to include influence on subsequent discussions of cultural relativism, human rights, and the ethics of cross-cultural encounter that would shape European responses to colonialism, while providing conceptual foundation for anthropological and sociological approaches to cultural analysis that emphasized empirical observation rather than theoretical prejudice. The contemporary relevance of Montaigne's analysis includes its anticipation of problems that continue affecting relationships between dominant and marginalized cultures in ways that demonstrate the continuing importance of his insights about how philosophical reflection can serve purposes of moral education and political reform when directed toward practical questions about justice and human dignity that transcend particular cultural circumstances. Michel de Montaigne of Cannibals had demonstrated how honest intellectual investigation could challenge conventional assumptions about civilization and barbarity, while providing foundation for more respectful and accurate understanding of cultural difference that served both scholarly and moral purposes in ways that purely academic or purely political approaches to these questions could not achieve through systematic methodology or ideological commitment alone. Chapter 11. The Art of Conversation. Throughout his essays, Michel de Montaigne returned repeatedly to the theme of conversation as both the highest form of human pleasure and the most reliable method for developing practical wisdom through intellectual exchange that could achieve insights unavailable to solitary reflection or formal academic study. His analysis of conversational art drew on his personal experience of perfect friendship with La Bataille, his observations of social interaction during his travels and public service, and his understanding of how dialogue could serve educational purposes that systematic instruction typically failed to achieve. The qualities that Montaigne identified as essential for excellent conversation included intellectual curiosity without pedantic display, emotional openness without sentimental self-indulgence, and critical judgment without personal hostility that could maintain respectful disagreement while pursuing truth through collaborative investigation rather than competitive debate designed to establish superior knowledge or social status rather than mutual understanding and practical wisdom. The social conditions that made genuine conversation possible required participants who possessed sufficient education to discuss complex questions, adequate leisure to pursue topics without time pressure, and psychological security that eliminated the need to use intellectual interaction for advancing personal interests rather than exploring ideas that might prove valuable regardless of their contribution to individual reputation or professional advancement. The topics that Montaigne considered most suitable for serious conversation included moral questions about how to live well, political problems about how societies could achieve justice and stability, literary analysis that could enhance appreciation for human creativity and cultural achievement, and philosophical investigations that could clarify fundamental assumptions about knowledge, reality, and value without claiming systematic completeness that experience could not support. The conversational techniques that Montaigne had learned through years of social interaction included the ability to listen carefully to other perspectives, to ask questions that encourage deeper reflection rather than defensive responses, to acknowledge uncertainty and complexity rather than rushing toward premature conclusions, and to maintain focus on subjects that deserved serious attention while avoiding trivial topics that wasted intellectual energy. The psychological benefits that resulted from excellent conversation included intellectual stimulation that enhanced individual thinking capacity, emotional satisfaction that came from genuine human connection, moral education that occurred through exposure to different perspectives and values, and practical wisdom that emerged from collaborative analysis of complex problems that required multiple viewpoints for adequate understanding. The social functions that conversation served included the transmission of cultural knowledge from older to younger generations, the development of shared understanding among community members who needed to cooperate in addressing collective problems, the refinement of individual judgment through exposure to criticism and alternative viewpoints, and the creation of bonds of friendship and respect that strengthened social cohesion. The educational applications of conversational method challenged conventional approaches to instruction that emphasized information transmission rather than the development of critical thinking skills and practical judgment that genuine learning required. According to Montaigne's understanding of how intellectual development actually occurred through interactive engagement with complex questions, rather than passive reception of authoritative answers. The literary dimensions of Montaigne's conversational ideal influenced his approach, essay writing as a form of written dialogue with readers who could respond to his ideas through their own reflection and analysis, rather than merely accepting his conclusions as final authorities on questions that required continued investigation by each individual who encountered them in circumstances that might reveal aspects that Montaigne's particular experience had not illuminated. The political implications of Montaigne's emphasis on conversation included his conviction that democratic governance required citizens capable of intelligent discussion about public questions, and that social harmony depended on the ability of different groups to communicate across cultural and religious differences through shared commitment to rational discourse rather than emotional manipulation or ideological coercion. The religious applications of conversational method appeared in Montaigne's approach to theological questions as subjects for respectful exploration rather than dogmatic assertion, while maintaining reverence for spiritual mysteries that human reason could not completely comprehend, but that sincere inquiry might illuminate sufficiently for practical purposes of moral and spiritual development. The cultural criticism that Montaigne developed through analysis of contemporary conversational practices revealed how political polarization, religious conflict, and social competition were corrupting intellectual discourse while creating conditions that made genuine communication increasingly difficult to achieve, despite its necessity for addressing complex problems that required collaborative wisdom rather than partisan ideology. The historical perspective that informed Montaigne's understanding of conversational art included appreciation for classical models of philosophical dialogue, while recognizing how contemporary circumstances required adaptations of ancient techniques to address problems that classical authors had not anticipated, and that modern conditions made particularly urgent and complex. The practical recommendations that Montaigne offered for improving conversational skills included suggestions about how to choose appropriate topics, how to maintain focus without becoming rigid, how to disagree respectfully without abandoning critical judgment, and how to learn from others without losing intellectual independence that authentic thinking required. The moral philosophy that emerged from Montaigne's analysis of conversation emphasized the ethical obligations that intellectual interaction created among participants who shared responsibility for pursuing truth through collaborative investigation while respecting individual differences and maintaining standards of honesty and civility that made productive dialogue possible rather than competitive display or social entertainment. The psychological insights that Montaigne gained through reflection on his own conversational experiences revealed how social interaction could serve purposes of self-knowledge and personal development while providing opportunities for intellectual growth that solitary reflection alone could not achieve, despite its necessity as complement to, but not substitute for, genuine dialogue with other minds. Michel de Montaigne's analysis of conversational art had identified one of the essential components of civilized life, while providing practical guidance for achieving the kind of intellectual and social interaction that could serve both individual development and collective welfare through methods that remained relevant for contemporary discussions about how to maintain democratic discourse and cultural dialogue in complex, pluralistic societies. Chapter 12. The School of Suffering. As Montaigne entered his 50s, the kidney stones that had plagued him intermittently for years became a constant and increasingly severe source of physical pain that provided unwelcome but instructive education in how suffering affected consciousness, character, and philosophical conviction in ways that purely theoretical approaches to these questions could not anticipate or adequately address. His detailed analysis of his own experience with chronic illness became one of the most psychologically penetrating accounts of pain and mortality that European literature had yet produced. The medical treatments that Montaigne pursued for his condition included consultations with numerous physicians whose conflicting diagnoses and therapeutic recommendations revealed the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge while demonstrating how authority figures could maintain confidence, despite their obvious inability to provide effective help for problems that exceeded their understanding or technical capabilities. The daily realities of living with unpredictable episodes of severe pain taught Montaigne about the relationship between physical and mental experience in ways that challenged philosophical assumptions about the mind's independence from bodily conditions, while revealing how suffering could either enhance or diminish intellectual capacity, depending on how individuals responded to circumstances they could not control, but might influence through conscious choice about attitude and behavior. The social dimensions of chronic illness included the ways that pain affected Montaigne's ability to participate in normal activities and maintain ordinary relationships, while teaching him about human compassion and its limitations. As friends and family members struggled to provide support that could not eliminate suffering, but might reduce the isolation that often accompanied prolonged physical distress. The philosophical questions that Montaigne's illness raised about the value and meaning of suffering challenged conventional religious and moral assumptions about pain as divine punishment or character-building experience, while revealing how individual responses to unavoidable difficulties could demonstrate practical wisdom or moral failure, depending on whether suffering was accepted with grace or resisted with futile resentment that increased rather than diminished overall misery. The literary opportunities that chronic illness provided enabled Montaigne to write about pain with empirical authority that purely imaginative or theoretical treatments of suffering could not achieve, while demonstrating how personal experience could be transformed into universal insights about human nature and the conditions that made flourishing possible, despite inevitable encounters with physical limitation and mortality. The psychological effects of prolonged pain included periods of depression, irritability, and despair that alternated with intervals of unusual clarity and emotional intensity that taught Montaigne about the complex relationships between suffering and consciousness, while revealing how adversity could sometimes enhance rather than diminish capacity for reflection and creative work. The practical adjustments that living with chronic illness required included modifications of daily routines, travel plans, and social commitments that demonstrated how external circumstances could force changes in lifestyle and priorities, while providing opportunities for discovering what was truly essential for personal satisfaction and meaningful activity, as distinguished from conventional expectations about appropriate behavior for men of his social position. The moral insights that emerged from Montaigne's experience with suffering included recognition that pain was a universal human condition that connected him to others regardless of their social status or cultural background, while teaching him about compassion, patience, and acceptance as practical virtues rather than merely theoretical ideals that sounded admirable but proved difficult to implement when actually needed. The spiritual dimensions of Montaigne's encounter with chronic illness included questions about divine providence, personal responsibility, and the relationship between temporal suffering and eternal significance that he explored with characteristic intellectual honesty, while avoiding both naive optimism and cynical despair that seemed equally inadequate responses to experiences that required more nuanced understanding than systematic theology typically provided. The observational opportunities that illness created enabled Montaigne to study his own psychological processes with unusual attention and objectivity, while providing material for analysis of how consciousness functioned under stress in ways that normal circumstances did not reveal as clearly or dramatically as periods of acute physical distress that stripped away conventional social masks and psychological defenses. The comparative perspective that Montaigne's travels had provided proved valuable for understanding how different cultures approached illness, aging, and death through various medical, religious, and philosophical traditions that offered alternative frameworks for making sense of suffering, while suggesting that no single approach possessed complete wisdom about experiences that remained mysterious despite centuries of human reflection and investigation. The literary techniques that Montaigne developed for writing about pain included methods for describing physical sensations and psychological states with precision and honesty, while avoiding both excessive self-pity and false stoic detachment that would have betrayed the actual complexity of his experience in favor of conventional expectations about how educated men should respond to adversity. The practical wisdom that Montaigne extracted from his encounter with chronic illness included insights about how to distinguish between difficulties that could be ameliorated through intelligent action and those that had to be accepted as inevitable features of human existence, while maintaining appropriate effort to improve circumstances that remained within individual influence despite their ultimate limitations. The cultural criticism that Montaigne's illness enabled included analysis of how his society responded to suffering and disability through medical, social, and religious institutions that sometimes provided genuine help, but often reflected more concern for maintaining conventional order than addressing actual needs of individuals who required assistance that challenged normal expectations about productivity and social participation. The educational value that Montaigne found in his experience with suffering included lessons about human nature, social relationships, and personal priorities that painful circumstances revealed more clearly than comfortable situations, while demonstrating how adversity could serve pedagogical purposes when approached with appropriate intellectual curiosity and moral seriousness, rather than passive resentment or false heroics. Michel de Montaigne's school of suffering had taught him about the possibilities and limitations of human wisdom when confronted with experiences that could not be eliminated through intelligence or virtue, but could be approached with greater or lesser understanding and grace that made significant differences in their meaning and their effects on character and consciousness. Chapter 13. The Final Essays. In the last years of his life, between 1588 and 1592, Michel de Montaigne produced some of his most profound and psychologically penetrating essays while facing the physical decline and approaching mortality that gave urgency and depth to his reflections on questions that had occupied him throughout his literary career. These final works demonstrated the full maturity of his philosophical thinking and literary artistry while maintaining the intellectual humility and conversational intimacy that had always distinguished his writing from more systematic approaches to the subjects he explored. Of experience, the magnificent concluding essay of the final edition synthesized Montaigne's mature understanding of how practical wisdom could be achieved through sustained attention to particular circumstances rather than systematic application of general principles, while demonstrating how individual self-knowledge could provide foundation for insights about human nature that transcended personal limitations without claiming scientific precision or philosophical completeness. The psychological self-analysis that reached its culmination in these final essays revealed patterns of thought and behavior that Montaigne could observe with increasing objectivity, while accepting with compassionate understanding as characteristic features of his temperament, rather than moral failings requiring correction or elimination through willpower or theoretical instruction that experience had shown to be inadequate for achieving fundamental changes in personality or character. The literary techniques that Montaigne had perfected through decades of essay writing enabled him to present the most complex ideas in prose that achieved classical ideals of combining instruction with pleasure, while maintaining the conversational spontaneity that made his writing feel like intimate correspondence rather than formal academic discourse designed to impress readers with erudition rather than communicate genuine insights about important questions. The philosophical synthesis that emerged from Montaigne's final essays integrated skeptical epistemology with practical ethics in ways that avoided both dogmatic certainty and paralyzing relativism, while providing guidance for moral action that respected the complexity of human nature and social circumstances without retreating into cynicism or moral nihilism that would have made meaningful choice and commitment impossible. The political reflections that occupied much of Montaigne's attention during his final years drew on his experience as mayor of Bordeaux and his observations of French religious warfare to develop approaches to governance that emphasize practical problem-solving and respect for individual conscience, while maintaining social order through methods that minimized rather than eliminated the coercion that seemed necessary for collective security and cultural stability. The religious investigations that characterized Montaigne's late work revealed growing spiritual sophistication that could appreciate the wisdom of traditional Christianity while maintaining critical distance from institutional claims and doctrinal formulations that seemed to exceed what human reason could validate or personal experience could confirm. Through individual spiritual development and moral practice, the cultural criticism that Montaigne developed in his final essays analyzed how European civilization had produced both achievements and pathologies that revealed the ambiguous character of historical progress, while suggesting that improvement was possible through conscious effort and practical wisdom, but could not be guaranteed through systematic planning or theoretical consistency, that historical experience had shown to be inadequate for addressing complex social problems. The educational insights that Montaigne extracted from reflection on his own intellectual development and observation of how learning actually occurred challenged conventional approaches to instruction, while emphasizing cultivation of judgment rather than accumulation of information as the proper goal of educational effort that could prepare individuals for the practical wisdom that life required, rather than merely professional competence or social advancement. The literary influence that Montaigne's final essays would have on subsequent European culture included their demonstration of how autobiographical writing could achieve universal significance through honest self-examination that revealed patterns of human experience rather than merely personal idiosyncrasies, while maintaining respect for individual complexity that systematic approaches to psychology and ethics typically reduced to manageable but inadequate generalizations. The moral philosophy that emerged from Montaigne's mature reflection emphasized practical wisdom and compassionate understanding rather than systematic ethical theory, while maintaining standards of intellectual honesty and personal integrity that could guide individual behavior without claiming universal validity that different circumstances might make inappropriate or impossible to achieve through conscious effort alone. The historical consciousness that informed these final works demonstrated how individual experience could provide insight into universal patterns, while respecting the particular circumstances that made each person and each historical period unique, rather than merely illustrative of general laws that claimed predictive authority but lacked adequate empirical foundation for reliable forecasting about future cultural or political developments. The artistic achievement that Montaigne's final essays represented included their integration of philosophical sophistication with literary elegance in ways that influenced subsequent development of both systematic philosophy and creative literature, while establishing essay writing as a legitimate form for serious intellectual investigation that could address ultimate questions without sacrificing aesthetic pleasure or conversational accessibility. The personal significance that these final essays held for Montaigne included their function as intellectual testament that could preserve his insights and observations for readers who might find them useful, while providing him with a sense of completion and purpose that made approaching death less terrible through consciousness that his life had produced something valuable that would survive his individual mortality. The continuing influence that Montaigne's final essays would have on European intellectual development included their provision of models for how serious thinking could be pursued outside academic institutions, while maintaining rigorous standards of analysis and evidence that could contribute to cultural conversation about important questions without claiming institutional authority or systematic completeness that individual investigation could not achieve. Michel de Montaigne's final essays represented the culmination of a lifetime devoted to honest self-examination and careful observation of human nature that had produced wisdom about the possibilities and limitations of individual understanding, while demonstrating how intellectual humility could serve practical purposes that systematic knowledge claimed, but could not deliver through purely theoretical approaches to questions that required empirical investigation and personal experience. Chapter 14. The Art of Living. In his final years, Michel de Montaigne achieved what classical philosophers had identified as the highest human achievement, the art of living well, which required neither perfect knowledge nor complete virtue, but rather practical wisdom about how to navigate the complexities of existence with grace, dignity, and compassionate understanding of both human possibilities and human limitations. His integration of intellectual sophistication with emotional acceptance created a model for how educated individuals could respond to life's challenges without losing either critical judgment or psychological equilibrium. The daily routines that structured Montaigne's later life reflected his mature understanding of how to balance the competing claims of solitary reflection, social responsibility, physical health, and intellectual productivity, while maintaining the flexibility that changing circumstances required, rather than rigid adherence to systematic principles that experience might prove inadequate or inappropriate for particular situations that demanded practical wisdom rather than theoretical consistency. The relationships that Montaigne maintained during his final years demonstrated his ability to appreciate different forms of human connection without demanding the perfect friendship that he had experienced with La Bataille, while finding genuine satisfaction in the various types of understanding and affection that marriage, family, friendship, and intellectual community could provide when approached with appropriate expectations and generous interpretation of others' limitations. The literary work that occupied much of Montaigne's attention during this period included continuous revision and expansion of his essays as he discovered new insights through continued living and thinking, while maintaining intellectual honesty about the provisional character of all human understanding that made final authority impossible to claim, even for ideas that had proved useful over extended periods of testing and application. The political engagement that Montaigne continued despite his official retirement from public office reflected his recognition that individual well-being and collective welfare were mutually dependent, while requiring different approaches to moral and practical problems that could not be resolved through purely private reflection or purely public action, but demanded integration of personal wisdom with civic responsibility. The philosophical investigations that characterize Montaigne's mature thinking emphasized practical questions about how to live well rather than theoretical problems about ultimate reality, while maintaining intellectual rigor and empirical grounding that distinguished his approach from both naive optimism and cynical relativism that seemed equally inadequate responses to the complexity of human experience and social organization. The spiritual development that Montaigne achieved during his later years combined reverent acceptance of mystery with critical evaluation of religious claims, while finding practical guidance in traditional wisdom that had been tested through centuries of human experience, rather than demanding systematic theological knowledge that seemed beyond human cognitive capacity to achieve or institutional religious authority to validate. The physical health problems that increasingly affected Montaigne's daily life provided continuing education in accepting limitations while maintaining appropriate effort to ameliorate difficulties that remained within individual influence through dietary modification, exercise, medical treatment, and psychological adjustment that could improve quality of life without eliminating the fundamental vulnerability that characterized human existence. The social observations that Montaigne recorded during his final years revealed his growing appreciation for the ordinary virtues and simple pleasures that made life worth living despite its inevitable disappointments and sufferings, while recognizing how easy it was for intellectual sophistication or social privilege to create expectations that made contentment difficult to achieve through normal human relationships and activities. The educational insights that Montaigne continued developing through reflection on his own learning and observation of others' intellectual development emphasized the importance of cultivating judgment rather than accumulating information, while providing practical guidance for how individuals could continue growing intellectually and morally throughout their lives, regardless of formal educational opportunities or social circumstances. The literary achievement that Montaigne's essays represented by the time of their final edition included their demonstration of how autobiographical writing could achieve universal relevance through honest self-examination that revealed patterns of human experience while maintaining respect for individual uniqueness that made each person's life worthy of careful attention and sympathetic understanding rather than merely illustrative of general principles. The cultural influence that Montaigne's work was already beginning to exercise during his lifetime included its provision of alternative approaches to intellectual and moral questions that challenged both medieval scholasticism and Renaissance humanism, while offering practical wisdom that educated readers could apply to their own circumstances without requiring systematic philosophical training or institutional religious commitment. The moral philosophy that emerged from Montaigne's mature reflection integrated skeptical epistemology with ethical commitment in ways that avoided both dogmatic certainty and moral nihilism, while providing guidance for individual behavior that respected complexity and uncertainty without abandoning standards of honesty, compassion, and practical wisdom that experience had shown to be both achievable and valuable for human flourishing. The psychological insights that Montaigne achieved through sustained self-observation and analysis of human behavior revealed patterns of consciousness and character that influenced subsequent development of both scientific psychology and literary exploration of mental life, while maintaining appreciation for the mystery and unpredictability that made human personality irreducible to systematic description or theoretical explanation. The historical significance that Montaigne's essays would achieve included their role in establishing individual consciousness as a legitimate subject for serious intellectual investigation, while demonstrating how personal reflection could contribute to cultural understanding and social wisdom through methods that transcended conventional distinctions between private and public, subjective and objective, literary and philosophical approaches to important questions. The continuing relevance that Montaigne's insights would maintain for subsequent generations included their practical applicability to situations and problems that remained constant features of human experience, despite changing historical circumstances, while providing conceptual frameworks and analytical methods that could be adapted to address contemporary challenges without losing their essential wisdom about human nature and social organization. Michel de Montaigne had mastered the art of living through integration of intellectual curiosity with emotional acceptance, critical judgment with compassionate understanding, and individual authenticity with social responsibility that created a model for how educated individuals could achieve practical wisdom while maintaining intellectual honesty about the limitations of human knowledge and the complexity of moral choice in circumstances that offered no perfect solutions, but required decisions that could be made more or less wisely. On September 13, 1592, at the age of 59, Michel de Montaigne died peacefully at his chateau while attending Mass in the chapel he had built for his household, surrounded by family members and servants who had shared his daily life during the years of retirement that had produced the literary masterpiece that would make him immortal. His death was as thoughtful and measured as his life had been, occurring while he participated in the religious observances that provided spiritual framework for existence, without requiring him to abandon the intellectual independence that had characterized his approach to all questions requiring human judgment. The immediate cause of death was likely a throat infection or stroke that prevented speech during his final days. But Montaigne faced this loss of his most precious faculty, the ability to communicate through language that had been the medium for his greatest achievements, with the same acceptance of limitation and change that had characterized his philosophical response to all experiences that could not be controlled through human will or intelligence, but had to be endured with grace and dignity. The practical arrangements that Montaigne had made for his literary legacy included provisions for the preservation and publication of his essays that would ensure their survival, while respecting his conviction that authors should not attempt to control how their works would be interpreted by future readers who would encounter them in circumstances that the original writer could not anticipate or influence through explicit instruction about proper understanding or application. The personal effects that Montaigne left behind revealed the material simplicity and intellectual richness that had characterized his daily existence. A library containing the books that had shaped his thinking, manuscripts recording his observations and reflections, correspondence documenting his relationships with friends and fellow scholars, and the architectural modifications to his chateau that had created physical spaces appropriate for the kind of life he had chosen to live. The grief that Montaigne's death created among family members, friends, and intellectual correspondents reflected genuine affection for his personality as well as recognition of his achievements. But it was tempered by understanding that he had lived fully according to his own deepest convictions while producing literary work that would preserve what was most valuable in his insights and observations for readers who could benefit from his practical wisdom and psychological penetration. The immediate literary response to Montaigne's death included tributes from contemporary writers who recognized his originality and influence, while acknowledging that assessment of his ultimate significance would require longer perspective than could be achieved by individuals who had known him personally or shared his immediate cultural circumstances, but whose judgment might be influenced by personal relationships or contemporary controversies. The publication history of Montaigne's essays during the years immediately following his death demonstrated the broad appeal of his writing for educated readers throughout Europe, while revealing how different cultural and national contexts influenced interpretation of his ideas in ways that confirmed his conviction that meaning could not be entirely controlled by authorial intention, but required collaborative creation through reader response and cultural appropriation. The influence that Montaigne's essays began to exercise on subsequent European literature included their demonstration of how autobiographical writing could achieve artistic excellence and philosophical significance while providing models for integrating personal reflection with cultural criticism that influenced development of both creative literature and systematic philosophy during the centuries that followed his death. The philosophical legacy that Montaigne established through his essays included his contribution to skeptical tradition that questioned dogmatic claims while maintaining commitment to practical wisdom and moral responsibility. His analysis of human nature that combined scientific observation with compassionate understanding, and his demonstration of how intellectual humility could serve constructive rather than destructive purposes in addressing complex questions about knowledge and value. The political influence that Montaigne's ideas would have on subsequent European development included their contribution to concepts of tolerance, individual liberty, and cultural diversity that would become essential components of liberal democratic theory, while providing practical guidance for how pluralistic societies could maintain social order while respecting differences of opinion and cultural background that made coercive uniformity both impossible and undesirable. The educational impact that Montaigne's essays would have included their influence on pedagogical theory and practice that emphasized development of critical thinking and practical judgment rather than mere information transmission or vocational training, while providing models for how learning could continue throughout life through methods that remained available to individuals regardless of their formal educational opportunities or institutional affiliations. The religious significance that Montaigne's work would achieve included its contribution to development of more sophisticated and psychologically realistic approaches to spiritual questions that could appreciate the value of traditional wisdom while maintaining intellectual honesty about the limitations of human understanding and the complexity of moral choice in circumstances that required faith and commitment despite irreducible uncertainty about ultimate questions. The cultural criticism that Montaigne's essays provided would continue influencing European self-understanding through their analysis of how civilization could produce both achievements and pathologies that revealed the ambiguous character of historical progress, while suggesting approaches to social problems that emphasize practical wisdom and gradual improvement rather than systematic reform based on theoretical principles that historical experience had shown to be inadequate for addressing complex cultural challenges. The psychological insights that Montaigne developed through his self-analysis and observation of human behavior would influence subsequent development of both scientific psychology and literary exploration of consciousness, while establishing individual mental life as a legitimate subject for serious intellectual investigation that could contribute to understanding of universal patterns in human experience without reducing personal uniqueness to general laws or theoretical abstractions. The artistic achievement that Montaigne's essays represented would continue influencing European literature through their demonstration of how prose writing could achieve both intellectual sophistication and aesthetic pleasure, while providing models for integrating analytical thinking with creative expression that remained relevant for writers who sought to address serious questions without sacrificing literary quality or cultural accessibility. The international reputation that Montaigne would achieve through translation of his essays into other European languages demonstrated the universal appeal of his insights, while revealing how ideas could transcend the cultural circumstances of their origin when they addressed fundamental aspects of human experience that remained constant despite historical change and cultural diversity. Michel de Montaigne had completed his demonstration of how individual consciousness could become a lens for understanding universal human nature while maintaining respect for complexity and mystery that made systematic knowledge impossible, but practical wisdom achievable through sustained attention, intellectual honesty, and compassionate understanding of both human possibilities and human limitations that characterize the examined life at its finest. Within decades of Michel de Montaigne's death, his essays had become essential reading for educated Europeans who discovered in his writing a new way of thinking about individual consciousness, cultural diversity, and the relationship between knowledge and wisdom that would influence Western intellectual development for centuries. The man who had claimed to know nothing except himself had accidentally created one of the most influential explorations of human nature ever written while inventing literary and philosophical methods that remained relevant for addressing questions about authenticity, tolerance, and practical wisdom in complex modern societies. The immediate influence of Montaigne's essays on late Renaissance and early modern European culture included their impact on writers like Shakespeare, who drew directly on Montaigne's cultural relativism and psychological insights for plays like The Tempest and Hamlet, and Francis Bacon, who adapted Montaigne's essay form for his own moral and scientific investigations while developing different approaches to empirical methodology and systematic knowledge that reflected English rather than French intellectual traditions. The philosophical significance of Montaigne's contributions to skeptical tradition became apparent as subsequent thinkers like René Descartes and Blaise Pascal engaged with his epistemological arguments while developing their own approaches to questions about certainty, doubt, and the relationship between reason and faith that acknowledged Montaigne's influence while attempting to overcome the relativistic implications that they considered dangerous for both scientific progress and religious commitment. The political influence of Montaigne's ideas about tolerance, cultural diversity, and individual liberty provided intellectual foundation for liberal democratic theory that emerged during the Enlightenment through thinkers like John Locke and Voltaire, who adapted his insights about the limitations of systematic knowledge and the value of practical wisdom for addressing questions about governmental authority, religious freedom, and social organization in pluralistic societies. The educational impact of Montaigne's approach to learning and intellectual development influenced pedagogical reformers like John Dewey and Maria Montessori, who emphasized experience-based education, critical thinking, and respect for individual differences rather than standardized curricula and authoritarian instruction that Montaigne had criticized through his analysis of how genuine understanding actually occurred through personal investigation and reflective practice. The psychological insights that Montaigne developed through his self-analysis and observation of human behavior provided foundation for subsequent development of empirical psychology through thinkers like William James and Sigmund Freud, who recognized his pioneering exploration of consciousness, personality, and emotional development, while developing more systematic scientific approaches to questions that Montaigne had investigated through literary and philosophical methods. The literary influence of Montaigne's essays on subsequent European and American writing included their demonstration of how autobiographical reflection could achieve artistic excellence while addressing universal themes that made personal experience relevant for readers who had not shared the author's particular circumstances, but could recognize similar patterns in their own psychological and moral development. The anthropological and sociological implications of Montaigne's cultural relativism influenced development of more sophisticated approaches to understanding human diversity through thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Clifford Geertz, who adapted his insights about the relationship between universal human nature and particular cultural expressions while developing systematic methodologies for cross-cultural investigation that Montaigne had initiated through his analysis of travel accounts and ethnographic reports. The religious and spiritual significance of Montaigne's approach to ultimate questions influenced development of more nuanced theological thinking that could appreciate traditional wisdom while maintaining intellectual honesty about the limitations of human understanding and the complexity of faith in circumstances that required commitment despite irreducible uncertainty about metaphysical and moral questions that admitted no definitive rational resolution. The influence of Montaigne's essays on modern existential philosophy became apparent through their anticipation of themes that would be developed by thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who recognized his pioneering exploration of individual authenticity, moral choice, and the relationship between consciousness and existence, while developing their own approaches to questions about freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of human life. The contemporary relevance of Montaigne's insights for addressing current cultural and political challenges includes their applicability to questions about multiculturalism, globalization, and the relationship between individual rights and social responsibilities that democratic societies continue struggling to resolve through methods that could benefit from his practical wisdom about tolerance, compromise, and the limitations of systematic solutions to complex human problems. The feminist implications of Montaigne's approach to gender questions revealed both progressive insights about women's intellectual capacity and conventional assumptions about social roles that reflected his historical period, while providing foundation for more sophisticated analysis of how cultural expectations shaped both male and female development in ways that limited human potential through artificial restrictions based on prejudice rather than empirical evidence about actual capabilities. The environmental dimensions of Montaigne's thinking about human relationships with natural world anticipated contemporary ecological consciousness through his observations about how different societies organize their relationships with physical environments while suggesting approaches to sustainability that emphasize practical wisdom and long-term thinking, rather than short-term economic advantage that characterize much European, colonial, and commercial activity. The technological implications of Montaigne's approach to knowledge and cultural change provided framework for evaluating how scientific and technical innovations affected human consciousness and social organization, while maintaining critical perspective on claims about inevitable progress that failed to consider negative consequences of developments that serve particular interests rather than general human welfare. The therapeutic applications of Montaigne's insights about self-knowledge and emotional acceptance influenced development of counseling and psychotherapeutic approaches that emphasized understanding and integration rather than elimination of psychological complexity, while providing practical guidance for achieving mental health through methods that respected individual uniqueness and cultural diversity. The artistic and creative significance of Montaigne's essays included their demonstration of how intellectual investigation could be combined with aesthetic pleasure, while providing models for integrating analytical thinking with imaginative expression that influenced subsequent development of both philosophical writing and creative literature that sought to address serious questions without sacrificing literary quality or cultural accessibility. Michel de Montaigne's ultimate legacy consists in his invention of the modern self as a subject worthy of serious intellectual investigation, while demonstrating how individual consciousness could become a lens for understanding universal human nature through methods that combined rigorous analysis with compassionate acceptance of complexity and mystery that made systematic knowledge impossible, but practical wisdom achievable for anyone willing to pursue honest self-examination with appropriate intellectual humility and moral seriousness. The candles burned low in Michel de Montaigne's Tower Library on September 13, 1592, but the questions he had posed about human nature, knowledge, and the art of living continue to illuminate the territory where thinking and being intersect. 59 years of gentle skepticism had produced insights about wisdom, tolerance, and self-knowledge that would prove increasingly relevant as the modern world struggled to balance individual authenticity with social responsibility, cultural diversity with shared values, and intellectual honesty with practical commitment to principles that could guide action despite permanent uncertainty about ultimate questions. Montaigne was gone dead peacefully at his chateau while attending Mass, having spent his final conscious years transforming private self-examination into public wisdom that could benefit others. But the integration of intellectual rigor with emotional acceptance that he had achieved would inspire subsequent generations of thinkers who recognized that authentic understanding required both critical analysis and compassionate recognition of human limitation and complexity. The man who had claimed to know nothing except himself had accidentally created one of the most influential explorations of what it means to be human, while inventing literary and philosophical methods that remained relevant for anyone seeking to understand their own consciousness and its relationship to the larger world of culture, politics, and moral choice that defined the conditions of modern existence.